Hi, everyone. Welcome to A Human Planning Process, Climate Adaptation. My name is Bethany Ayers Fisher, and I'm here with my friends Bethany Anderson and Shayna Rose. And we're going to talk a little bit about what climate adaptation planning is, and all three of us are involved in the process in different ways. I want to go to the next slide, Shayna. Oh, wow, I'm first. So hi, I'm Bethany. I'm a current graduate student at Alvernia University. I'm studying climate adaptation in communities. For fun, I'm a master watershed steward and a member of the Angelica Creek Watershed Association. And for work, I work as the community outreach and education coordinator for City of Reading Public Works.
Hi, everyone. I'm Shayna Rose. During COVID last year, I founded my own podcast and platform called Sustaining with Shayna, where I focus on local issues about sustainability that are not being covered by the conventional news, or topics or issues around sustainability that a conversation hasn't started yet, or that people just don't know about in our community. I graduated from Kutztown University with my undergrad degree in environmental geography and psychology. And one of the most exciting things that I always love when talking about in these spaces is I have been a delegate twice to the UN climate talks. And so that was in 2017 and 2019. And a fun fact about that, I was actually a delegate on behalf of the Republic of Liberia when I went in 2017. But also some other stuff I do in the community. I had founded a committee at my congregation talking about creation care. So talking about this from a religious perspective. And have been involved in a lot of other stuff too in the community.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Anderson. I am a professor of writing at Reading Area Community College. I'm also a mom. I do some yoga and some running and some bird watching too. And locally, I have been director and coordinator of Reading for 100. And I'm so happy to be here with you all tonight.
Okay. So I guess where we want to start is with what the United Nations global goals for sustainable development are. People who are much smarter than I am have gotten together in these huge meetings, and and Shayna can speak more of this to this because she was involved. But the goals in general are to not have poverty, not have hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, industry innovation and infrastructure, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below water, life on land, peace, justice, and strong institutions, and building partnerships for the goals. So it's kind of a way to help all of us who are either policymakers or decision makers, and also who are stakeholders in all of this all around the world, to really help shape the way we're thinking about how we're going to be building our communities and what kind of neighbors we want to be to each other. And Shayna, do you have any thoughts since you've been a part of this process?
So what I'll do is during the next slide, I'll talk more about this. So like Bethany said, so we have the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and they were established, or they were formed or created at events like this. So this is basically every year with the UN climate talks, you have delegates from all the sovereign nations around the world and other organizations too, like the indigenous community. Finally, within the last few years, has their own separate delegation speaking about issues, of course, that are very impertinent. But actually, the UN Sustainable Development Goals have been established, but maybe not in practice as much as we realize, but actually came out of one of these agreements or one of these legislations that happened long before the Paris Climate Agreement. So when we think about the Paris Climate Agreement, that was a hallmark legislation that I don't know the exact number, but I think it was like 197 different countries around the world that was the first time that we collectively have talked about these issues and agreed upon some sort of legislation that we could all adhere to. So I wasn't fortunate enough to be at the signing of the Paris Agreement, but I was able to go to Madrid, which was the one right before COVID lockdown started, but also going to Bonn, Germany in 2017. And it's fascinating to see how you have this conglomeration of not just delegates representing their country. So some of them could be the heads of their nation's EPAs, or they could be head of maybe their they could be the Secretary of Defense, whatever it may be that seems important to serve as a delegate. But also sometimes we have politicians who are appointed as delegates or other community members. And it's fascinating to see the different dichotomy of all these people that are there. And it's kind of a microcosm of the rest of the world. And you kind of see the power and influence of politicians and corporations when it comes to drafting this legislation, but also seeing how civilian organizations, so doctors, clergy to activist groups, are all trying to have their voice heard with these various issues.
Yeah.
And because of that, legislation is created like the Paris Agreement that will kind of talk about the more localized things that builds a structure for what countries do around the world.
Shayna, can I ask how you got to do this? I mean, this is a big deal to get invited to go to one of these. How did that happen for you?
So at the time, especially the first time, I was a member of a subgroup within the American Association of Geographers. So this is pretty rare that something like my first COP situation happened, where I left the US as a delegate or representative of behalf of the American Association of Geographers. But because I met official leaders of, I think it was the undersecretary of the environment of Liberia when I was there that I met, offered to give me credentials to join his country's delegation, because smaller nations like his either use or lose their delegations the next year kind of situation. So I actually got more access to the first COP that way. So it's interesting because that really doesn't happen. But then the following year, 2018, I was also able to possibly go to, that was in Katowice, Poland, with the American Association of Geographers. But timing wise and travel expenses, it didn't work. But then I was able to go in 2019 as part of this new faith-based delegation that was a conglomeration of different religious groups from around the world that were building this network of having people of faith start to like experience, have opportunities to experience these negotiations firsthand on the ground. So it's really interesting, but to put it simply, it's like if you can get in the door the first time, it's really easy to find ways to go back, but you have to find the right people the first time. It's all in who you know, really, to be honest. And then it kind of rolls from there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So I do want to talk about the 3 pillars of sustainability. We, as humans, we like to throw around our fancy words, but sustainability is not just being environmentally sound. It's not just being financially sound. It's not just being socially sound. It's where all those 3 things overlap and are in balance. So when we're looking at making a decision to maybe purchase a new furnace, which I had to do a couple of years ago, I wanted something that was going to be very environmentally friendly. I also wanted something that we could afford. And also I didn't want something that was going to pollute or be annoying to my neighbors. So we ended up, having to take all of those things into consideration to find a sustainable option. It is really important when we're talking about sustainability and talking about how we're going to do things like energy transitions or automobile fuel transitions, that we make sure that things are financially viable, and that people are going to actually be able to participate in them. It can't just be the environment that we're considering. If people aren't willing to do the transition, it's going to fail. If we can't afford to the upkeep, it's going to fail. And of course, if we keep polluting so much, it's going to fail. So that's a really important thing that we have to consider. So if we want to go to the next slide. So the climate action plans really started coming out of just the general kind of realizing that we need to start doing something about what is happening to our environment. Part of that is a mitigation strategy. So thinking about things like, how do we fix the problem? How do we transition from a fossil fuel source to a renewable fuel source? But also adaptation strategies. The adaptation strategies are actually what I'm the most interested in studying, and seeing how people adapt to a change. And Pennsylvania started developing their climate action plan in 2008. It is evidence-based. There's a lot of studies involved. It is very strategy focused to help municipalities, companies, and individual families come up with ways that we can contribute to not only adapting well to the challenges that we're facing, but also helping to reduce some of the impacts. It not only allows for community level participation. In order to do these plans, it is required to do community level participation. And I have to give mad props to the EPA to the DEP and the EPA for giving practitioners of these plans a whole lot of support and actually training on doing it. And the climate action plans also encourages cooperation, and not only between state and cities and federal kind of thing, but also between industries and communities. There's a whole section in the climate action plan about how you look for co-benefits, and co-benefits are either mitigation strategies or adaptation strategies where essentially you get more bang for your buck. So for example, if we're having to build a new road project, making sure that we're implementing additional stormwater benefits, like where we're reducing the amount of runoff that's going into the rivers. So maybe we do something like install a tree trough. So we're getting new trees planted. They're helping with stormwater issues as we're building the new roads. And so it's looking for those kind of the best bang for the buck strategies, and solving more than one problem with the same project. We want to go to the next slide, Shayna. And so the process is pretty simple, but it's very involved, and it does take quite a bit of time and staff time with this. So risk assessments need to happen. A lot of time the risk assessments are actually done as part of the community hazards plan, which is another plan that happens within municipal, county, state, and national level planning processes. One of my favorite parts of the climate action planning is actually looking at our assets and what people love about our community and what we all consider as our assets. And one of my favorite assets about living in Reading and Berks County is that we have a forest in our city. Like, we live in a forest, and not a lot of cities get to have that asset. And then also our resource assessments. So what kind of resources do we have? What kind of institutions do we have? What kind of people power do we have? Of course, how much money do we all have? And then the final part of the climate action planning is what is appropriate for our community and what are we willing to do? And that is the stakeholder engagement. And of course, the most important part is who is the stakeholder. Of course, it's experts and decision makers, but it's also you and me. We are all stakeholders in this, and we all have a part to play. And we can go to the next slide. Shayna, you're muted.
I forgot that I was muted, and also I didn't realize that the space bar changes the slides because it temporarily unmutes you with that. So maybe we could crop this part out. Oops.
It's okay.
Okay, but I do have a question.
Okay.
So with all that said, I do have a question both for you and Stephanie, because I'm largely not involved in the local climate action plan, but I was wondering how there's a way that, if it is built in or could be built in, of like finding ways to incentivize people on behavioral changes. Because one of the things I found in doing work with sustainability and being on the ground where they're still negotiating the Paris Agreement in person, that it just feels a lot of times the reason why I think we would get so stuck on not instituting these things fast enough, or the power of something like the Paris Agreement loses its impact, is because we're so driven on like meeting quota or meeting data or meeting metrics, but we'll never get there if we don't change behaviors. So has there been any built-in incentives to that other social side of sustainability where it's like either incentivizing or almost even forcing behavioral changes? Because without those behavioral changes, we won't get there.
I have been looking at a lot of the climate action plans of cities who have had them longer term. The oldest ones are around 10 to 12 years old. And there has been a lot of incentivizing within the cities that they're working really well in. And I think that's something that we definitely need to talk about in Reading and in Berks County as we do ours. What those are going to look like, I don't know, because we haven't quite started those conversations yet, but I agree, they're really important to do. And because what are we willing to do? Like, how can we change? But also, what do we need to be able to do that change? And I think that's a really important part of the whole process. Stephanie, your thoughts?
Well, I certainly have struggled with the same question, so I'll begin by saying that. And I think a lot of the direction I'm headed in terms of a potential answer is that really change has to be internalized, right? Like, so people have to see the value of the movement forward in their own context, in their own lives.
Mm-hmm.
And as a storyteller, I have found that storytelling tends to lend some opportunities for community members to begin to find ways to integrate, plans for the future into the context of their own lives, and then vice versa too. Like, what do their lives have to do with the climate action plan? And I think it's not as straightforward as we might think. I work with a lot of students every semester in freshman composition at the college, and we begin with simply the definition of sustainability, definition of climate change. And I would say every semester, approximately 90% of my students really don't know what either is, and therefore couldn't possibly have any idea what it has to do with them. And because they don't know what it is, they have been assuming for many years that it doesn't have anything to do with them. So the more conversations we have, which conversations I think are their own art and their own form of storytelling, and the more stories we tell and the more we connect with one another, the more we're going to create opportunities for people to begin to see how this is related to them, and therefore create motivation to begin to change.
Yeah, I agree. One of the things that I've been spending my COVID time looking at is climate change specifically in Reading, and where we have gone and how has the climate changed, and also how have our predecessors adapted. One of my favorite places in Berks County is Angelica Creek, which at one point was a lake, and it was dammed up in around the 1860s or so to make ice, to manufacture ice. So they used to be able to harvest these huge 3 by 3 by 3 foot cubes of ice. And by 1910, the Reading Ice Company changed its name to the Reading Ice and Water Company because it wasn't making ice reliably at that point. And then it got sold to the city as a park in 1925. And it was a park, and lovely park. People loved it for years. And then shortly after I moved to Berks County, it was the first tropical storm I had ever gone through. Hurricane Allison broke the dam, and then we lost the lake. And then over the last 24 years or so, we've been doing the restoration. And it's it's such a beautiful place, and the stream's doing great. And but like, how has it changed? The land use has changed, and how we use the resources have changed. And it's just fascinating to me. But yeah, being able to tell those stories and have it relate to everybody in our life.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your comments with that. And Bethany, I would be interested in hearing more just specifically about like how climate change looks in Reading and Berks County over time. I feel like that would be an interesting conversation in of itself.
Yeah, I think that we'll have to get together and do that after I write that paper.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay.
So you may have heard of Reading for 100. And we're one of the organizations behind the City of Reading's resolution to transition to renewable energy. Reading for 100 took life in 2017, actually, with the support of the Sierra Club. And they had started a national movement called Ready for 100, which was intended to support local grassroots efforts to commit municipalities to 100% clean energy. I had volunteered for the local branch of the Sierra Club known as the Kittatinny Group, and they asked if I wanted to take the lead on a Ready for 100 movement in our area. And to be honest, I was really nervous about agreeing to the task because I knew very little about municipal government or clean energy or how a community would go about transitioning to clean energy. After all, I'm just a writer and a teacher and a mom, and it's really hard, I think, to imagine yourself as a climate activist or advocate when you're really not sure how to imagine how all of the pieces are going to come together. Who was I to lead a clean energy movement in a city where I didn't even live? But I went ahead and agreed to it anyway. And it turned out that, what I really needed to know how to do was connect with my community. It was with many other people and organizations that I was able to ultimately help write a resolution that was unanimously adopted by City Council in Reading in June of 2019. Reading was the 19th city in Pennsylvania to commit to clean energy and the 130th city in the US. So here I am with the goal to step up for this effort. And the result is that our community has made a promise born from the community's concern over the past, present, and of course the future. We're a community of people who understand that finding a way to live sustainably means finding a way to live affordably, equitably, harmoniously, and in good health. So Reading for 100's role is to support the effort of turning the promise we made into, a reality in the future.
Yeah. I remember when it was, when the resolution was passed, I was actually in the process of interviewing for the position I have and being like, okay, this is awesome. And then, oh, wait a minute. Now we have to implement. But that's part of the fun part, I think, is getting the implementation done. But thank you, because we all need to be pushed.
Yeah, and I have to say it's interesting to see like what progress and like change has happened in that time, and even with COVID being stalled, it's still kind of like pushed our process back. But it's interesting how both the resolution and also the concept of what Reading for 100 is trying to do has become more of a kitchen table discussion topic. Or it's interesting when I talk about Reading for 100 with people I didn't think would know what it is, actually do. And it's fascinating how much in these few short years, how much progress will happen. And random, I guess, like fact or like contextual idea is that I came home from my first UN climate talk, so I was like used to negotiations and seeing things like on an international scale maybe less than a week before my first meeting for Reading for 100. I actually got the email about this group forming while I was there. So it's like fascinating to see the progress that's happened in 4 years. And at first it didn't seem like a lot, but I feel like have accomplished a lot in that time.
Yeah, I would agree. And a lot of it has actually happened behind the scenes, but there's going to be a lot more happening publicly as well.
Here's Reading for 100's mission. I'm going to read it out loud just because I think it's really important to sort of define, who we are, where we've been, and how we see ourselves, a part of not only the plan, but also a part of the community. Reading for 100 is a diverse and inclusive group of concerned Berks County residents dedicated to building a better future for all by supporting the City of Reading's just transition to 100% clean, renewable, and fully accessible electricity by the year 2035, and fully clean and renewable energy in all sectors by 2050. So here's the thing. In order to create the kind of future on the planet that works for everyone, Reading for 100 believes that we have to recognize the roots of our current inequities so that we can work actively to avoid the same mistakes that created those inequities in the first place. Climate change is disproportionately affecting the poorest, most marginalized communities, which are the very communities that have contributed least to the worsening of climate change in the first place. And this is the very definition of inequity. A few of us have most of the money with which we overconsume in such a way that we hurt the planet, the economy, and humans, in particular, Black and brown humans. And in this way, the effort to create a sustainable future is not just about electricity. It's not just about carbon and GHGs. It's about people. It's about community. It's about us.
So I do have a question there for Stephanie. So you did say GHGs. Can you explain what those are for those that might not know?
You're going to ask the creative writing teacher.
Maybe I'll take that one.
Thank you, Bethany.
Right. So greenhouse
in the atmosphere.
I just wanted to know what the acronym meant. That's all.
So greenhouse, so GHG are greenhouse gases. So greenhouse gases are gases, mainly carbon dioxide, but methane, that tend to like to hang out in the atmosphere for a long time. They don't like to break apart, and they hold energy from the sun in their chemical bonds. So like carbon dioxide is a carbon atom and 2 oxygen atoms. And if you can see like kind of the carbon atom holding on to the oxygen atoms, and then they start kind of dancing around and they get very excited. And that energy creates and traps more heat in our atmosphere. And so we've been seeing things like changes in the jet stream and warming at in the polar regions more rapidly than other places. And everybody's like, oh, but the plants need carbon dioxide. We exhale carbon dioxide, they inhale it. But what the problem is we're out of balance. We're putting way more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and have been doing that for about the last 300 years than the plants can handle. And so we need to reduce what we're putting in the atmosphere, so that way we can kind of stop this warming, which is changing our weather and changing our climates and affecting people.
Thank you.
Is that helpful?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure.
Simultaneously, right, we're taking out old growth forest that does the job of storing that carbon in the ground.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Right.
We're actually compounding the problem in a couple of ways.
Yes.
Yeah. And there's a reason why it's called anthropogenic or quote unquote human caused climate change.
Yes.
Yeah. Because
we did this.
Yeah. We set up the process.
Yeah, we absolutely did this. And it started from energy transitions that happened many years ago. So, the northern areas of the planet were deforested to burn for fuel. And then they kind of ran out of that and then, went to coal. And then we had all kinds of air pollution issues. And we've gotten somewhat better, but like we're way too dependent on the fossil fuels and pumping all of that carbon that had been kept underground for eons and eons, like really, really long periods of time, not affecting the atmosphere. Now it's affecting the atmosphere. And that's where we got into trouble. So we did it. We have to fix it.
I'm muted. So I think it's interesting to ask those questions, because I think, for a long time, I assumed that the conversation about what climate change is and whether or not it exists needs to be over. But I have spoken to so many people who have really genuine questions. They're not just trying to be difficult. Students and neighbors and folks. And so I do think that part of connecting with the community is connecting them with information that they can trust. And so I'm learning how to do that, like how do you connect people with scientific studies that are accessible And how do you help folks, decipher between social media memes and real scientific information? And I do think that that's part of this effort. So yeah, Reading for 100 and the City of Reading believe that equity and sustainability can begin with a climate action or a climate action plan and transition to a clean energy, because clean energy can actually create a lot of what climate change threatens, infrastructure, energy, economy, efficiency, jobs, and more. And it can do so in a way that doesn't just benefit a few of us. We believe that if we transition in a way that represents the interest of our entire community, we can build a system that works for us all.
Yeah, and that's the really important part.
So I'm just going to go through, I think, the most important points of the resolution itself. A lot of people, have heard of the resolution, maybe have even seen a little bit about it in the paper, but don't really know the finer points. So it was adopted in June of 2019. It includes several benchmarks, right? So one is that we were to have sort of a draft of a plan forward by July of 2020. And really, I think the city did fairly well with that, regardless of the pandemic. There is sort of a framework, which Bethany can speak a little bit more to, as a pathway forward. And the resolution mentions that the city is committing to transitioning to 100% clean energy or electricity by the year 2035. And then, of course, in all energy sectors by 2050, which would include transportation. And we want to make sure that that transition is equitable and affordable. So I think a lot of the fear is, well, wait a minute, clean energy is more expensive and we don't want to have to shoulder that expense. And certainly this transition would take into account that we don't just want renewable and clean forms of energy. We also want those to be accessible and equitable to all. Next slide. 2 parts. Therefore, we did commit to quantify the city's use of electricity, which we have, I had nothing to do with it, which the city accomplished already, that I'm sure Bethany can speak to more. And then a municipal energy master plan, and that the city would produce, through partnership with the Reading community, a clean energy plan that allowed us to see how we might move forward, prioritizing the lowest cost measures to meet the energy needs, and that the city would seek to collaborate with surrounding communities to share best practices, which we are doing. The plan will include interim milestones, equity metrics, estimated financial impacts, financing mechanisms, and the percentage of clean, renewable energy that shall be generated locally. So I don't want to get in too much detail here, but there is a difference between, buying RECs, or in other words, balancing the equation of your energy use, and actually generating energy in the community in a way that will create economy and actually contribute to the amount of clean energy or the percentage of clean energy in the overall grid, rather than just sort of borrow from other clean energy sources, so that our equation or our carbon footprint measures out a little bit better. The city will ensure that the benefits of clean, renewable energy transition include low income and historically marginalized residents, and the public will have opportunities and be encouraged to participate in the process, which is what one of the things I am most excited about.
Yeah, I have to say, for those who are listening to our conversation, I encourage you to read the City of Bethlehem's Climate Action Plan that was just released within the last 2 weeks. And it was exciting during COVID to be able to kind of peek in on their conversations. Now, their process was a little different, but it's interesting to see how every city is a little bit different, even ones that are less than an hour away from us.
Yeah, each community is unique, has different needs, different obstacles, and therefore, their plan will be different. But I absolutely agree, looking at how other communities are finding success in their climate action planning can only benefit us.
Mm-hmm.
Ready for 100 does believe that a future of 100% clean and renewable energy is actually entirely possible and becoming more and more possible every day, locally, at the state level, nationally, and even globally. We define clean energy with the following: wind, solar, small hydro, tidal, fuel cells, geothermal. And of course, we do want to make sure we are prioritizing locally produced and distributed energy, which we also feel is totally possible. And ultimately, we think that that will not only make the energy more affordable, but will also help to create economic growth right here in Redding and Berks County. We also know that part of moving into a sustainable future powered by renewables means creating more energy efficiency, examining the gospel of consumption, what we consume, how much, and then learning to consume far less, living differently, so there is enough for everyone on the planet and in our community. And so all of us have the same chance for survival.
Yeah, I always like to say that we're not in the same boat, but we're in the same storm, and some of us have bigger boats. And being able to make sure that those of us who may have a bigger boat can help somebody with the smaller boat and work together.
Yeah, the resolution, prioritizes community, and we know that a resolution becomes a plan, that as our resolution becomes a plan and ultimately a reality, it will have to stay rooted in those community efforts. We want to make sure that, as we begin to shift back to normal out of pandemic life, that Reading for 100 and the city and, all of us work together to connect with the community so that we are facilitating this sort of consistent cycle of the planning process and the community connecting. And so there's open communication. I like this graphic because, it sort of shows how community remains at the heart of all three processes. And I think we're still in the planning process. And as planning begins to turn into implementation, I think that it will be equally as important to see the community be a part of that. And that includes all of you. So each one of us, matters. And earlier on, we talked about how do we incentivize change? And I think, again, the answer to that is complex and large. I'm only one person with one set of experiences, but the more I talk to people, the more I realize that there oftentimes incentives or inspirations come from human connection, from hearing other people's story, one like Angelica Creek, but also, stories about inequity, stories about access to food and clean water and to green spaces and to good health care. And those stories are really going to begin to allow us to synthesize our knowledge about not just one another, but also our knowledge of the planet and the science behind climate change. The more we're connecting and sharing our stories openly, the more we are going to not only feel inspired, but also create inspiration in others as we move forward. So that just sort of emphasized that not only is it essential for this to be a macro effort, community-wide global effort to save the planet on which we live, but it's equally as important for it to be a micro effort, an individual effort, something that we work towards on a very, very personal, intimate level. So as we move forward with the planning process, we'll begin to imagine a way that we can liberate ourselves from the chains of fossil fuels, learning new ways to live, to consume, to create equity, to consider one another, and to consider the planet, and ultimately create and adapt a future that works for us all. It will happen in increments, and it will ultimately have to happen with an awareness of one another.
Yeah, I really like the graphic, that it's not a hard stop. It's not going to be a sudden cutting off and shifting. It's going to be a gradual process. And since I've had the opportunity to start digging into the history of different actions in Reading, the realities that we face today are the result of decisions that were made, in some cases, many generations ago. And we have the same opportunity right now to not only improve our lives and our community, but also to improve things for the generations to come.
Right now, these are Reading for 100's priorities. We want to engage with the community. We want to make sure that all stories are being heard. And we are particularly interested in raising up voices that have been marginalized or that have not been heard. We're looking for different ways to do that. And I think what will be important is for there to be leadership from marginalized communities, and to have that leadership be diverse and in all sorts of ways, including age, because I think the more people we get that ultimately they're going to inherit the planet, and they have more energy and creativity. I think it's really exciting to see them get involved as well. We want to support municipal and administrative planning and strategy however we can. And we want to make sure that we are connecting the public with that planning strategy. So that's pretty much how Reading for 100 is defining their priorities at this time. So next slide shows how everybody else in the community can sort of get involved in that. So these are just a few things that, I have found that people find the most excitement and inspiration from adapting sort of their own interests and passions and talents to efforts like this. But here are a few things that we brainstormed together, and if there are other ways that you imagine that you can get involved, we are totally open to hearing about that. But, sharing and completing surveys for the city or for Reading for 100, writing for a blog, publishing work for Sierra Club magazines or other publications, including the Reading Eagle, assisting with social media, setting up community conversations, hosting those conversations, attending virtual city council meetings, hosting council meetings, or suggesting organizations or communities where council or where virtual meetings or conversations should take place. Even if those conversations happen in your own home or your own backyard. Even if you don't live in the city, you can organize in your area. You can even advocate for state level policy, which some of which is going to be happening actually this week virtually. And if you have other ideas, you can always reach out to us through email at readingfor100@gmail.com, and also through personal email stephaniejoyanderson@gmail.com. And my phone number is 610-301-1108. Again, 610-301-1108. Feel free to reach out if there are any ways that you want to get active.
So when talking about, we talked about the international level, then we also talked about the state level and the local community-wide level and specific municipalities. But also it's important to understand the individual and the personal level and the social side of sustainability when talking about that. So this is a diagram to kind of give you an idea of how we don't just experience climate change on a large scale or even on a big enough scale in our community, but we also experience it on an individual level. So there's all these different factors that affect our health. And one of those, especially that's really important to talk about, is air pollution. And we've seen people who live in more marginalized communities and more Black and Brown communities are more highly susceptible to contracting and getting sick and unfortunately dying from COVID-19 because of the fact that they already have uh, these other factors in their current environment that could possibly weaken their immune system or could also affect them on other levels, especially when it comes to air pollution. Uh, but then there's also other factors where whether it's food supply and food deserts and lack of access to healthy, uh, fully nutritional food. But then there's also when we talk about extreme heat and how that affects us, not just physically, but also the next slide, I'll talk about how that affects us psychologically. So when we talk about climate change, there's so many health impacts to it, but we don't necessarily think about how that could possibly affect our mental health. And there's been studies done that show how people who are exposed to climate change or the increased stressors that come with climate change uh, are more likely to either have worsening or develop new psychological conditions, along with also physical conditions as well. And I read a report recently that was talking about uh, the psychological impacts of climate change that's a part of a larger book that was written. And it talked about how they're even discussing people who experience natural disasters all the time. And now, with the added influence of climate change, that there is almost um, this how would I say it's like it's a newer worsening factor of stress. So instead of having post traumatic stress from an issue, uh, there's this new discussion and research talking about pre traumatic stress, so that your brain is already thinking that it already knows what the stress is. So instead of post traumatic stress disorder, there's research out there that is discussing how um, pre traumatic stress, so stress that you're already visualizing before it even happens. Uh, and some statistics that are out there, I would highly recommend to possibly look up. There's a whole report that was done with the American Psychiatric Association about this a couple years ago. And these are just two statistics alone that show that people are concerned about climate change and how it possibly affects their mental health, but also the fact that there's research that shows how much mental health is being impacted by climate change and how even just the increase in temperatures are affecting people's psychological well-being. And why I say all this is the fact that with doing the work in communities like the three of us are, and doing community organizing and also community engagement, it's really important to understand not just if people understand what climate change is and understanding how it could affect them, but how it literally is affecting us in our communities right now on a personal level with our health. And it's been really enlightening to see how the discussions that I've had with people on how we don't talk enough about the personal aspect of climate change, or we don't talk enough about like the individual or community aspects of it. And I think that a lot of the health or mental health aspects to it have been lost in the conversation, or uh, clinicians and medical professionals have been really late to the table talking about these issues. And because of that, we've only recently heard a lot of these terms develop that are still ever growing, like eco anxiety, and really showing how people are just specifically becoming more anxious about things that we never would think about or would take for granted.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think all three of us are really focused on building those capacities in our community to have these discussions, and also really give people resources and tools to make themselves more resilient, and then in turn make our community more resilient. We're seeing with the increase in natural disasters, some communities bounce back pretty well and others just really seem to struggle. And that is both a leadership issue, but also just a community readiness issue, and making sure that, you know, not only is my family going to be okay, but are my neighbors going to be okay? You know, how are we going to get through this crisis, but then how are we going to recover from it? And I think that's a really important part of the conversation that we need to be having.
Yeah, and I think that's largely of why I started the Sustaining with Shayna podcast, because like I felt that there wasn't enough conversation. I think not just like on the mental health aspects, but also like what you're talking about, Bethany, that it's like I think we haven't thought some of these issues through, both individually and collectively as a community. So I find when I talk to people that a lot of times I'm like the only one that talks about sustainability, and they're like, "Oh, you're our sustainability guru." But I mean, I shouldn't be, because this is an issue that affects us all
Yeah.
on so many different levels.
No, I find that with my friends too. When I went back to school, it was because I had a midlife crisis, and I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I knew I did not want to be a nurse. But I wanted to do something that was just going to, where I could just be useful to the community, and kind of fell into climate policy and environmental health. And my friends are the same way. They're like, "Oh, okay, that's about it. They'll be fine." But you know, but then I have to sneak in the conversation so that way I can literally get some data and start recording data. And some of my friends are like, "Oh, are you writing this down?" I'm like, yes, I am. I need to, you know, I need to, it's important that everybody has really understands what we're facing, but also has a say in, okay, what am I willing to do? And also, what do we need to do as a community? Right there. I'm a big believer in do what you can with what you have where you are. And that's how we're going to make it through this. Stephanie, any other thoughts?
Not offhand. I really like the last thing you said, though. Do what you can with what you have, because I think that the idea that who am I can't do anything at all stops too many people from doing anything.
Yeah.
Including me. It did for a long time, even when I was, you know, totally immersed in this climate anxiety, nightmares and panic attacks all the time. I just kept thinking that you know, really part of the cycle of anxiety is about that powerlessness. So even if there are small steps forward, you know, not only does that help you feel better, you know, on like an individual level, but also small steps lead to bigger steps, you know, eventually. And so you just sort of follow that trail.
Yeah. And no one is ever perfect. I mean, I still have my addiction to Ziploc freezer bags. I just like them. And not any one of us can do everything, and not any one community can do it all. And I think that's really important to remember. And we don't have a magic pill that we can take. It's not going to be just one thing to kind of change. It's going to be a lot of small incremental things that we all do individually and collectively that forms our future, really, and the future for our kids and our grandkids and all of us who come after. What kind of community do we want to leave them?
Yeah, I think that was a really poetic way to put it, for sure.
And I'm the science person, Stephanie's the poet. But I get angry when people fearmonger about this kind of things, and it's just not necessary. Do we have things to fear? Yes, but do we need to make each other full of anxiety and full of not feeling like we have the power to do what needs to be done? We absolutely have the power to do what needs to be done. We just need to take it and take those steps and work together.
Yeah, I read something interesting that really felt like it rang true. It was actually last semester, where an expert says that part of the problem with the way we talk about climate change is too much fear or not enough fear. And he said that when you talk about it, you have to present the truth, like you can't hide it, but you always, like, the human brain is trained to sort of run from anything that there doesn't seem to be a conceivable solution to. So if you don't offer up action, if you don't offer up, but we can do this in that conversation or in that presentation, the human brain is far more likely to pretend that it's not happening, to turn away and not respond to it at all, and not deal with it, and sort of shut down. So that makes a lot of sense to me, because I think that was part of, it's what I see in a lot of people, that it's just too overwhelming to deal with if there are no real steps that they can take to do anything about it. So I always try, when I'm having conversations like this, to remember that, kind of holding the back of my mind, like, if we're not talking about how we move forward, are we really just trying to make each other miserable and sort of halt effort? So I think that's important.
Yeah. So I just want to say this. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen, but we can still continue the conversation. So then we're not like
doing the fear mongering. Yes.
Yeah, we're staring at the statistic. But I did want to recommend for you both, but also the listeners, because Stephanie was talking about this and it got me thinking about this book I found, that it's Don't Even Talk About It, Why Our Brains Are Hardwired to Ignore Climate Change. And I feel like this is a perfect book to read, to like think about like why we run away from these discussions, even with ourselves.
Yeah, I will add it to my TBR list. My TBR, to be read, since we're not speaking in acronyms.
Jargon.
I know we have gone way longer than we thought, but we also knew that if we got the three of us together in this conversation, we would probably go all evening. So does anybody have anything that they want to wrap up with?
I did want to say one thing. So talking about the personal aspects of it all. But before I do that, shameless plug, if you're interested in listening to my podcast, it's on Apple Podcasts and like on all major platforms. But if you'd like to check out the website, it's Sustaining with Shayna, and Shayna is spelled SHANA, all one word, .com. And also the one thing I wanted to say, I read this in a book within the last few months during COVID, and actually a guest who will be on my next season, she's a psychoanalyst from the UK, and she wrote a book called Towards an Eco Psychotherapy, and it was interesting, not necessarily talking about like introducing the environment into like traditional therapy, but she integrates like all these reasons why we should from like a societal level. And it was interesting how like she went deep into talking about how we're so detached from nature as people. And I almost have like really wondered, and when I start to like try to have more deeper, meaningful conversations with people, that I just simply wonder how detached we are as individuals from nature itself. And I learned that the hard way during COVID, that I myself, who always talks about sustainability, have always been detached from nature, and only during COVID and spending time out in nature several times a week did I realize that how much I was even out of touch with it. And I think that just comes to the heart of all of these issues, is we just have separated ourselves from the very ground in which we stand on.
That's so important. I totally agree. And I think that we can relate that to how we separate ourselves from each other too. The more we spend time with nature, the more time we spend with one another, the more connected we're going to be to that balance that we're looking for. So the only thing I wanted to add is sort of my biggest takeaway in this whole process is, being a person who feels like I know nothing and I have no right to be in any of these conversations or part of any kind of municipal planning process. I have learned that, sitting at tables with people far more educated than I am, with a whole lot more experience than I have, and a whole lot more technical expertise. When I listen, there's, even if I'm confused about a lot, there's always something that I find that I can contribute, even if it's just a thoughtful question or an observation I have made personally. And it's been a wonderful surprise at almost every juncture for me. And so I hope to just inspire anybody who might be listening that even if you think you may not have something to contribute, you will probably be surprised.
I have to agree with you, Stephanie. I was always the person who was looking around to see who was going to do something because somebody should do something. And then one day I looked in the mirror and decided that nobody else is doing, so I guess it's my turn to do something. But I also want to close with loving. This is all about loving our neighbors. Love thy neighbor. It's the golden rule, and making sure that we transition well. I've been saying for the last 2 years, either change is going to happen to us or it's going to happen by us. And those have two very different outcomes. And we're always afraid that things are going to happen to us, but we need some help. We need everybody to get involved so it's happening by us instead of to us. So I want to thank everybody for listening to us ramble a little bit together. You have these conversations over like coffee every so often. And I want to invite everyone to join in the energy transition planning and the climate action planning that is happening. The City of Reading will be hosting some workshops this summer, and those are hoping to be both virtual and in person. And I'm thinking picnic style out in the park, spaced out, and where we can have these conversations. And listen to Shayna's podcast. I'm a subscriber. It's great. I enjoy listening to it while I'm trying to do some of my own work. And everyone should look at Ready for 100. And even if that's not the group for you, there are lots of groups doing this kind of work in so many different areas, where it's, it might be public health, it might be hunger issues. There's so many different ways to get involved because it's all interconnected and it all matters. So on behalf of Earth Day Berks, I want to thank you ladies for joining us. And I am going to stop recording and we're going to see how long we went. And there we go. Thanks, everybody.